Hello everyone, my name is Jamarl Thomas. I am your host. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Two pieces of news on Julian Assange. People often ask, I often look it up every so often. I kind of have like a periodic schedule where I look this stuff up to see if anything news on it. So two pieces of news on Julian Assange that I guess are notable. Three, if you include Pamela Anderson as being news on Julian Assange. But the two pieces. So the first one is good. The second one, I'm going to say bad just because anytime a state starts looking into something, especially when something seems punitive, I don't necessarily consider even the investigation itself as being positive. So the first one, the United Nations Office of Arbitrary Detention has put out a ruling. Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has put out a ruling that it doesn't necessarily like what's taking place regarding the UK and Assange. Basically, in a nutshell, they're saying that this seems punitive. This seems to go beyond just what would typically take place if this was a normal hearing. Not to mention, they put out a ruling earlier saying that the UK's detention of Assange, and they considered Assange as being stuck in the embassy as being a detention by the UK government, needed to end. The UK did not listen to that, and they upped the ante by putting him in prison for another year. Working Group on Arbitrary Detention looks at Assange. So the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, I'll read it, it's short. The Working Group on Arbitrary Detention is deeply concerned about the course of action, including the disproportionate sentence imposed on Mr. Assange. The Working Group is of the view that violating bail is a minor violation that, in the United Kingdom, carries a maximum sentence of 12 months in prison, even though the bond related to the bail has been lost in favor of the British government, and that Mr. Assange was still detained after violating the bail, which, in any case, should not stand after the opinion was issued. Understand what they're saying. It's like he was still detained. Whatever you want to call it, he was still being detained. Let me read that part again, just so we're clear. Like I said, they put out a ruling once before saying, let him out. The UK promptly ignored. The Working Group on Arbitrary Detention is deeply concerned about the course of action, including the disproportionate sentence imposed on Mr. Assange. The Working Group is of the view that violating bail is a minor violation that, in the United Kingdom, carries a maximum sentence of 12 months in prison, even though the bond is related to the bail that has been lost in favor of the British government, and that Mr. Assange was still detained after violating the bail, in which, in any case, should not stand after the opinion was issued. The Working Group regrets that the government has not complied with its opinion and has now furthered the arbitrary deprivation of liberty of Mr. Assange. Assange didn't, quote-unquote, violate bail and go, swimming in the Bermuda. He wasn't laying on a beach. He was still in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom may take the technical position that the Embassy of Ecuador was Ecuadorian territory, fair enough from a legal basis, but they were in the United Kingdom. He was stuck in the United Kingdom, and the box that they drew around the Ecuadorian embassy, for the most part, can be considered a jail cell, or arbitrary detention, as the United Nations calls it. It is worth recalling that the detention and the subsequent bail of Mr. Assange in the UK were connected to the preliminary investigation initiated in the 2010 by a prosecutor in Sweden. It is equally worth noting that the prosecutor did not press any charges against Mr. Assange, and that in 2017, after interviewing him in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, she discontinued the investigation brought and ended the case. The Working Group is further concerned that Mr. Assange has been detained since 11th of April 2019 in Belmarsh Prison, a high-security prison, as if he were connected with a serious criminal offense. This treatment appears contrived, and the principles of necessity and proportionality envisioned by the human rights standards. And appears to contravene, that's why I looked wrong. Appears to contravene the principles of necessity and proportionality envisioned by the human rights standards. The WGAD reiterates its recommendation to the government of the United Kingdom, as expressed in its opinion 54/2015, I suppose that's 5/4/2015, and its 21 December 2018 document or statement that the rights of Mr. Assange to personal liberty should be restored. I'm putting this at the bottom so you guys can read it for yourself. But ultimately, you guys are still keeping him in prison. And keep him in a prison for another year, which is the maximum of the standards, seems punitive. It seems punitive. Not to mention, we told you to let him go in the first place, and you continue to keep him longer. So there's that. Now, this document makes note that the Swedish prosecutor that initially was bringing this case forward spoke to Mr. Assange. Then, at that point, ended the case when they couldn't move forward through the case. The Swedish prosecutor is now considering reopening this case, which is my point of good news and bad news. I don't know what the United Nations is worth in this regard, because I've always said that there's no such thing as international law, and big nations promptly, expeditiously, or judiciously ignore the United Nations. So whatever it's worth, it's nice to have somebody in his corner, at least, and somebody saying it. This part is a little bit more disconcerting. Swedish prosecutor to give decision on Assange rape inquiry. I didn't believe that this case was earnest. Assange had pissed off a lot of people in the intelligence community and governments in general. And the United States had been rattling about getting their hands on Assange. Assange kept saying there is a secret warrant for my arrest. 7 years later, you find he was right. It brings me it makes me a bit more skeptical of this case. Let me say it that way. So, in a case that I find that may be potentially politically motivated, yes, I tend to be skeptical of it. By the same token, he was also willing to speak with the prosecutor. He wasn't trying to evade the law. His only request was, don't extradite me to the United States. That was his only request. They wouldn't say yes to that, meaning they were most likely going to do it. Sweden's state prosecutor would announce on Monday whether she would reopen the preliminary investigation into a rape allegation against Julian Assange. The WikiLeaks founder is imprisoned in Britain after he was arrested last month, a 7-year hold-up, Ecuadorian embassy, etc. We'll know Monday whether or not the prosecutor is going to reopen the case. Either way, this is the latest on Assange. There's one more story dealing with Pamela Anderson, which is neither here nor there for me. The extradition case is probably going to take at least a year. And Assange is going to fight it. And I got to be honest, I don't necessarily know if, there's no magical door. It's very possible that Assange gets to the United States. They can't validate the hacking charge at all. They have nothing on him in this case. Hell, they may even add stuff on it. But assume for the moment that the best of things takes place. He doesn't get extradited. That's still 7 years of his life that's gone. And even if he is extradited and he wins the case, that's still 7 years of his life held up in that goddamn embassy. Look, the UN is right on this. He was arbitrarily detained in that embassy. And now they're trying to get their hands on him and they're smearing him at every opportunity. That's it. Julian Assange. I'll end this here. I have another video after this, so I'll see you guys in roughly 10-15 minutes. Thanks all. If you enjoy the content, please consider supporting through PayPal or Patreon. And of course, if you like the video, hit like or share. Thanks all.